The glass tumbled from my hand, shattering against the kitchen tile with a sound that echoed my breaking reality. I stood frozen, staring at my phone at the notification that had just changed everything. Location sharing. Sarah is at Blue Moon Motel. It was midnight and my wife of 14 years wasn't home. I had never been the jealous type. In fact, the thought of tracking Sarah's location wouldn't have crossed my mind 2 months ago. But lately, something had shifted between us. Subtle at first, like the imperceptible movement of tectonic plates before an earthquake. Like the feeling before a tornado, I whispered to myself, remembering my grandfather's words about impending disaster. The air gets still, he'd said. Too still. And you just know. I picked up the fragments of glass, careful not to cut myself, though part of me wondered if physical pain might distract from the crushing weight in my chest. As I cleaned, memories from the past few months rearranged themselves into a pattern I'd been too blind, or too trusting, to see. The mysterious phone call she'd taken our backyard, voice lowered. The sudden business trips that appeared on her calendar with no prior discussion. The emotional distance that had grown between us, inch by glacial inch. But it was this morning that truly triggered my suspicion. Sarah had dressed with unusual care, selecting that burgundy dress she'd worn at our wedding. The color of wine, of blood, of endings disguised as celebrations. She'd applied her makeup meticulously, each stroke of mascara like battle paint. I'm meeting clients for dinner, she'd explained, avoiding my eyes. Might run late. As she was leaving, our daughter Zoe's small clock had fallen from the entryway table, shattering against the floor, a tiny cosmic warning I should have heeded more carefully. Sarah had paused, looking at the broken timepiece. Time always breaks at the most important moments, she'd said cryptically before kissing me goodbye. I hadn't planned to follow her. I'd simply offered to drop her at the restaurant. The Labyrinth, known for its romantic atmosphere and definitely not a place for client meetings. She'd insisted on taking a taxi. No need to trouble yourself, she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But some invisible force, instinct perhaps, or the accumulation of 1,000 tiny doubts, had compelled me to park nearby and wait. 40 minutes later, I watched as she emerged, not alone but hand in hand with a man I recognized immediately, Michael Dorian, her high school classmate. The same Michael she'd introduced to me at a corporate party last year as an old friend. The same Michael who now had his hand intimately resting on my wife's waist as she laughed. A bright, genuine laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I followed their taxi at a distance, each mile increasing the pressure in my chest. When they pulled into the Blue Moon Motel, a rundown establishment in the old part of town, the last fragments of my denial crumbled. A line from Robert Frost surfaced in my mind, "The darkest hour is just before dawn." But as I watched my wife of 14 years enter a motel room with another man, I wondered if dawn would ever come again. I drove home with trembling hands, my architect's precision suddenly failing me as I fumbled with the key in our front door. Inside, the house felt different. Less like home and more like a stage set where I'd been playing a role without seeing the full script. In our bedroom, I found myself pulling open Sarah's nightstand drawer, something I'd never done before. There, beneath a novel she'd been reading, lay an old journal. I recognized it, she'd kept it during our early days together. Without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket. Downstairs, I made myself a whiskey sour, my first drink in 5 years. As the alcohol burned its way down my throat, I remembered something my father had told me before he died. Truth is a tree with bitter fruit, Nick. But better to taste it than to starve on sweet lies. I settled into my study chair, journal in hand, and began to read. By morning, I knew my world would be irreversibly changed, but I couldn't go back to not knowing. Not anymore. The clock struck 1. Outside, a storm was gathering. Inside, one had already broken. Morning arrived with the harsh insistence of my alarm, though I hadn't slept. Sarah's side of the bed remained untouched. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the images from last night like a film I couldn't stop. Sarah laughing with Michael, their hands intertwined, disappearing into that motel room. I reached for my phone and called Greg, my boss at the architectural firm. "I need a day," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Some kind of stomach bug." There was a pause before Greg responded, "Sometimes sickness is what we need to see healing." The strange weight in his words made me wonder if he somehow knew more than I'd told him. After hanging up, I wandered through our empty house like a ghost. The children were at school, Alex in 2nd grade, Zoe in 5th. I was grateful they weren't here to see me in this state, unshaven and hollowed out. I settled at the kitchen table with Sarah's journal, thumbing through pages filled with her looping handwriting. Most entries were mundane, complaints about work, notes about the children's activities. But there were hints of discontent, small daggers hidden between benign observations. Nick works late again. Sometimes I wonder if he realizes we exist outside his blueprints and models. Ran into Michael today. He still has those eyes that see right through pretense. We talked for an hour at Meridian Coffee. It felt like breathing after being underwater too long. The entries grew sparse after Alex was born 7 years ago, but occasionally there were cryptic notes that now took on new meaning. The parallel life grows more vivid sometimes than the real one. In the living room, I noticed something I'd overlooked for months: our wedding photograph in a cracked frame. When had that happened? Had Sarah left it that way, a symbolic warning I'd failed to recognize? By noon I'd made a decision. I found the business card of Eleanor Gale, a former cybersecurity detective turned private investigator. A client had recommended her services last year when we suspected a contractor of fraud. "I can meet you in 30 minutes, she said after I explained the situation in clipped, clinical terms. "You know Panorama Cafe?" I did. It was a quiet place with large windows overlooking our neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would be staring at my own house from a distance, much as I now viewed my marriage. Eleanor was in her 50s, with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "In the age of social media, secrets are only seemingly hidden," she said after listening to my story, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. "Let me see what I can uncover." I handed her the keys to Sarah's car, passwords to our shared accounts, and a copy of her weekly schedule. Back home, I methodically searched through drawers and cabinets I'd never bothered to examine before. In Sarah's desk, beneath tax records, I found a letter from Princeton Genomics, a DNA test ordered for Alex. The date stamped was from 8 months ago. My hands trembled as I read it. The test had been initiated after an incident at school when Alex's biology teacher mentioned genetic traits in class. That evening, Alex had looked at me quizzically and asked, "Why do I have dimples in my cheeks when you don't, Dad?" I'd thought nothing of it at the time, explaining how genetics worked in simple terms a 7-year-old could understand. Now the question echoed with new significance. I pulled out our family photo albums, studying Alex's features with the scrutiny of a detective. His eyes weren't my deep brown but a clear blue. Like Michael's. 4 hours, I combed through Sarah's social media accounts, finding coded messages hidden in plain sight. Photo captions that seemed innocuous now revealed double meanings, timestamps that aligned with unexplained absences. 3 days later, Eleanor delivered her report. We met in her office, a sparse space with no personal touches. "The affair hasn't been going on for months," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "It's been almost 8 years with some breaks in between." 8 years. Just before Alex was born. "There were others," Eleanor continued, her tone professional but gentle. "At least 2 other men, but Michael has been constant, like the North Star in the constellation of her lies." I remembered how 2 years ago Sarah had started attending meditation classes every Thursday evening, returning home relaxed and centered. Another lie. Between the pages of the report, I found a receipt for an apartment rental in a neighboring town. Sarah had been maintaining a separate life just 20 minutes away from our home. As I drove back to the motel where I'd been staying, the world outside seemed distorted, as if I were looking at it through warped glass. Nothing was as it appeared. Not my marriage. Not my family. Perhaps not even my son. I pulled over, suddenly unable to breathe, the weight of these revelations crushing my chest. A passing dog walker stared at me with concern. I must have looked like a man having a heart attack. In a way I was. When I finally managed to start driving again, I noticed a billboard by the highway: "Truth will always find its way." The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. That night, I began to plan how I would confront Sarah. This wasn't just about our marriage anymore, it was about years of calculated deception, about a child who might not be mine by blood but was mine in every way that mattered. It was about reclaiming some fragment of truth in a life that had become a carefully constructed lie. I arranged the evidence meticulously across my home office desk, each piece placed with the precision I typically reserved for architectural blueprints. The DNA test results sat at the center, their clinical language confirming what my heart had already suspected. Alex was not my biological son. Around this devastating centerpiece, I arranged photos spanning 8 years, bank statements, motel receipts, and transcripts of text messages Eleanor had recovered. The children were asleep upstairs, exhausted from a day of normalcy I'd forced myself to maintain. Sarah had returned home the morning after I'd discovered her affair, acting as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't shattered the foundation of our family. I glanced at my watch. 11:23. I'd asked Sarah to meet me in my office when she returned from her book club. The irony of confronting her infidelity in a room I'd designed to be my sanctuary wasn't lost on me. I heard the front door open, then close softly. The sound of her humming drifted through the house. The Beatles, the long and winding road. Her footsteps approached, light and unsuspecting. I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath. She appeared in the doorway, still in her burgundy dress, a smile dying on her lips as she took in the scene before her. She froze like an actress who'd forgotten her lines, one hand still on the doorknob. "You know," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "I've always been fascinated by ancient literature. Medea, Jason, stories of betrayal." A nervous laugh escaped her. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "A month too late." I said nothing, just slid the folder of evidence toward her. She approached cautiously as if the papers might bite. When she opened the folder, her hands began to tremble. The first photos were of her and Michael outside the Blue Moon Motel, dated 8 years ago, around the time Alex was conceived. "You've been spying on me?" Her voice rose sharply. "You hired a stalker? Is that really your concern right now?" I asked, tapping the DNA test results. "Did you know all along, or were you uncertain yourself?" She snatched up her wineglass from my desk and hurled it against the wall. "This is illegal. You had no right to test him without my consent." "Interesting that you're worried about the legality of a DNA test rather than the violation of our trust," I said, leaning back in my chair. 14 years, Sarah. 14 years and 2 children. Children you barely see, she countered, switching tactics. "You love your drawings more than you ever loved us. You're just upset because your perfect little world isn't so perfect anymore. Is that how you justify it? By rewriting our history?" "Michael was my first love," she said, her voice softening. "We were together in high school before I met you. He understands who I really am." "And who is that, exactly? The woman who lies to her husband or the one who deceives her lover? Which version is authentic, Sarah?" I pulled out her journal and read aloud, "Sometimes lies keep our worlds together." Her face paled. "You read my journal? That's an invasion of privacy." "Privacy?" I laughed without humor. "You forfeited the right to privacy when you brought another man into our marriage. When you let me raise his child as my own." "Alex is your son," she insisted. "Biology doesn't make a father. On that we agree. But honesty makes a marriage, and you've deprived us of that fundamental element." I slid another document toward her, records of the secret bank account she'd maintained for years, funneling away money from our joint finances. I thought, for worse, in our vows was theoretical. Turns out it was prophetic. Her expression changed then, her eyes becoming cold and calculating, like glass in winter. The transformation was so sudden it startled me, as if a mask had fallen away, revealing someone I'd never truly known. She pulled out her phone and pressed a button. "Now it's my turn to tell my story," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. From her phone, she opened a folder labeled Project Phoenix, a collection of what she called evidence against me. She had documented every argument we'd ever had, cataloged my business trips, created a narrative of child neglect from evenings I'd worked late. She showed me edited screenshots of conversations where my words were taken out of context, videos of disagreements with the beginnings conveniently cut out. "You like the structured world of architecture?" she asked with a cold smile. "I'm a builder too, a constructor of new realities." She had even kept records of every time I'd come home late from work, presenting them as evidence of neglect rather than dedication to providing for our family. "Your perfect world is like a house of cards during an earthquake now," she said with a smirk. The woman standing before me wasn't the Sarah I thought I'd married. This was someone calculating, someone who had prepared for this confrontation perhaps longer than I had known about her infidelity. "How deeply must you hate me to have planned this for years?" I asked quietly. "This isn't hate, Nick," she replied, her voice chillingly calm. "It's strategy. I always look several moves ahead." I realized then that her affair wasn't just about passion, it was calculation. I remembered how last year she had suggested putting our house in her name, for tax benefits. I had nearly agreed. "The children will know the difference between truth and the performance you're so carefully directing," I said. Sarah stood like a change of acts in a theater. "Oh, Nick, do you still think this is about feelings?" Her parting words cut deeper than any before. "When I'm finished, you'll be nothing but a ghost in their lives, a fading shadow of a father." I met her gaze steadily. "You're not the only one who can play chess, Sarah. You just don't understand what board we're playing on." Something changed in Sarah's eyes as we stared at each other across the battlefield of my office. The warm amber I'd once found so captivating hardened into something cold and calculating, like glass in winter frost. It was as if a different person had taken control of her body, someone I'd never truly known despite 14 years of marriage. "You think you've won something here," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But you've merely started a game you don't understand the rules for." She pulled out her phone again, tapping the screen with deliberate precision. "I've been recording our entire conversation," she said. "Another piece for my collection." My stomach tightened. Recording without consent is inadmissible in court. A smile spread across her face, not the smile of the woman who had baked birthday cakes for our children or laughed with me under summer stars, but something predatory and unfamiliar. "The court of law and the court of public opinion operate under different rules," she said. "I have a folder on my phone labeled Project Phoenix. Would you like to see what rises from the ashes of your self-righteousness?" She turned the screen toward me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Years of meticulously documented evidence against me. Every argument we'd ever had, carefully edited to remove her provocations. Photos of me working late at my desk, captioned as abandonment. Screenshots of text messages where my words were taken wildly out of context. 732 instances of emotional neglect, she said, scrolling through the files. 96 missed dinners. 112 late returns home. All documented, dated, and ready for the right audience. She played a video clip where I was raising my voice during an argument, but the beginning of the recording where she had thrown a vase at the wall was conveniently missing. "You enjoy the ordered world of architecture?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "I'm a builder too, Nick, a constructor of new realities." I tried to steady my breathing. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning implies a fixed goal," she replied. "I prefer to think of it as maintaining options. Insurance against a rainy day." She gestured to the evidence on my desk. "And it's pouring now, isn't it?" She scrolled through more files, showing me how she documented every late night at the office, every business trip, every moment I'd spent focused on my projects instead of on her. All reframed as neglect rather than providing for our family. "Your perfect world is now like a house of cards in an earthquake," she said with a cold smile. I realized then that her betrayal ran far deeper than physical infidelity. This was calculated, methodical. She hadn't just been sleeping with Michael, she'd been building a case against me for years. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked finally. "Everything," she replied simply. "The house, the children, our savings. Your reputation will be collateral damage, but I'm willing to accept that. And if I fight? Then I'll use everything in this folder. I'll tell the children, our friends, your clients. I'll paint you as a monster in everyone's eyes. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if they let you have supervised visits once a month." I thought of Alex and Zoe sleeping upstairs, unaware that their world was fracturing beneath them. The thought of losing them made it hard to breathe. "How deeply must you hate me to have planned this for years?" I asked quietly. "This isn't hate, Nick," she replied, her voice chillingly calm. "It's strategy. I always look several moves ahead." I realized that her affair with Michael wasn't just about passion, it was calculation. I remembered how last year she had suggested putting our house in her name, for tax benefits. I had nearly agreed. "The children will see through this," I said. "They know who I am, who we are as a family." "Children adapt," she countered. "They believe what they're told, especially by a distraught mother who only wants to protect them from their unstable father." The words hit like physical blows. "You'd put them through that trauma just to win?" "Win?" She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "This isn't about winning, Nick. It's about surviving. It's about getting what I deserve after years of living in the shadow of your career, your needs, your life. We built that life together," I said. "Every decision was ours, not just mine." "Keep telling yourself that," she replied. "It might comfort you on lonely nights." She stood, smoothing her dress as if we'd just finished a pleasant dinner conversation. "I expect you'll need time to process this. When you're ready to discuss terms, let me know. But remember, the longer you fight, the more painful I'll make this for everyone." As she reached the door, she turned back. "Oh, and Nick? When I'm finished, you'll be nothing but a ghost in their lives, a fading shadow of a father who visits on holidays and birthdays if you're lucky." I met her gaze steadily. "You're not the only one who can play chess, Sarah. You just don't understand what board we're playing on." "Is that supposed to scare me?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. "No," I replied. "It's meant to prepare you. After she left, I sat in the stillness of my office, surrounded by evidence of one betrayal while reeling from the revelation of another, far more insidious one. The Sarah I thought I knew had never existed. The question now was, who would survive the unmasking? The law office of Jessica Levitt commanded a view of the courthouse that seemed almost symbolic, a constant reminder of what was at stake. I arrived 15 minutes early for my 9 o'clock appointment, my briefcase heavy with evidence of Sarah's deception. Sleep had eluded me after our confrontation, leaving me with dark circles under my eyes that no amount of coffee could erase. Mr. Kowalski? The receptionist looked up. Ms. Levitt will see you now. Jessica Levitt stood as I entered her office, a tall woman in her 50s with penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate and catalog every detail. Her reputation as the Valkyrie of matrimonial law was well earned from what I'd heard. Tell me everything, she said after we exchanged brief pleasantries. From the beginning, leaving nothing out. For the next hour, I laid out the entire painful story, Sarah's infidelity, the DNA test, her secret files, the threats. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook. When I finished, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if processing all the information. This isn't just divorce, she said finally, opening her eyes. This is psychological warfare. She reached behind her and pulled a book from the shelf, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Know your enemy and know yourself, she quoted, placing the book on her desk. Your wife has been preparing for this battle for years. We need to understand her strategy to counter it effectively. She has recordings of our conversations, I said. She's threatening to use them. Jessica nodded. Secret recordings without consent are inadmissible in court. But, she held up a finger, the court of law and the court of public opinion operate under different rules. She knows this. She pressed a button on her desk. Marcus, could you join us? Moments later, a man in his 40s with rimless glasses entered. This is Marcus Finn, our digital forensics specialist, Jessica explained. After I summarized the situation again, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. If she's been editing videos and manipulating evidence, we can prove it. Digital alterations leave traces, timestamps, editing artifacts, discontinuities in metadata. First we defend, Jessica said. Then when the time is right we counterattack. But with precision, not emotion. She outlined a preliminary strategy: secure my finances, document all interactions with Sarah, establish separate communication channels with the children. Don't contact her directly unless absolutely necessary, Jessica advised. Everything through text messages or email, create a record. And remember, every word you write might be read aloud in court someday. A cold realization settled over me. The DNA test will be central, won't it? Jessica nodded slowly. This isn't just about infidelity. It's about deliberate deception that affected a child's life, your life. Courts take that very seriously. As we talked, I remembered reading about gaslighting in relationships, the psychological manipulation that makes victims question their own reality. I was a textbook case, I realized. For years, Sarah had been constructing an alternate version of our marriage while I lived in blissful ignorance. What about the children? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since the confrontation. That's where we need to be most careful, Jessica said. Sarah will likely try to alienate them from you. We need to document everything while maintaining your relationship with them. On the drive home, a billboard caught my eye. Truth always finds its way, the same one I'd seen days before. This time it felt less like irony and more like a promise. When I arrived home, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the children, acting as if nothing had happened. She smiled brightly when Alex ran to greet me, but her eyes remained cold. After the children went to bed, she leaned close as she passed me in the hallway. I heard you visited the Valkyrie today, she whispered. Ambitious choice. I froze. How did you? Oh, Nick, she laughed softly. You still don't understand what you're up against, do you? Tomorrow brings a new act in our little play. I hope you've studied your lines. The realization that she was tracking my movements sent a chill through me. Oh, had she placed a tracker on my car? Hired someone to follow me? That night, unable to sleep in our bed, I moved to the guest room. As I was settling in, I noticed a small black device tucked behind the bedside lamp, a camera. With growing horror, I searched the room and found 2 more hidden devices. How long had she been monitoring me in my own home? I left them in place, not wanting to alert her that I'd discovered her surveillance. Instead, I took out my phone and texted Marcus, need to sweep house for cameras/bugs. Urgent. His reply came seconds later. First thing tomorrow? Say nothing. Act normal. I lay awake in the dark, aware that Sarah might be watching me at that very moment. The woman I had trusted with my life had turned our home into a surveillance state, our marriage into a battleground, and our children into pawns. Tomorrow would bring a new phase in this conflict. If Sarah wanted war, she would have it, but not on her terms. As an architect, I knew that even the most formidable structures could be dismantled once you understood their supporting elements. I would find the pillars of her deception and bring them down, one by one. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed 5:30 a.m. when I heard the front door open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, too heavy to be Sarah's. I sat up, instantly alert despite my fitful sleep. Before I could get out of bed, my bedroom door swung open. 2 police officers stood in the doorway, their expressions grim. Behind them, Sarah lingered in the hallway, her face a perfect mask of distress. Nicholas Kowalski? The taller officer stepped forward. His nameplate read Rodriguez. Yes, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. I need you to remain calm, sir. Rodriguez produced an official-looking document. I'm serving you with a temporary restraining order. The words hit me like a physical blow. Hey, what? You need to vacate the premises immediately. Rodriguez's tone was professional but firm. On what grounds? I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. Rodriguez glanced at the paper. Threatening behavior and emotional instability posing a risk to your family. I looked past him to Sarah, who was doing an impressive performance of a frightened woman, eyes downcast, arms wrapped protectively around herself. She'd changed from last night's confident manipulator to a victim in need of protection. May I see that? I asked, reaching for the document. As Rodriguez handed it over, I scanned the contents with growing horror. Sarah had filed a sworn statement claiming I had threatened her during our confrontation, that I had exhibited erratic and increasingly dangerous behavior, and that she feared for her safety and the children's. Attached were screenshots of our text messages, cleverly edited to remove context, and quotations from arguments we'd had over the years, presented as recent threats. She'd even included a photo of the broken wine glass from our confrontation, describing it as evidence of my violent outburst. My children's voices drifted from the hallway. Mom, what's going on? Alex's small voice asked. Why are the police here? Zoe's question was more direct. I moved toward the door, desperate to reassure them, but Sarah quickly ushered them away. Everything's fine, she told them. Dad just needs some time to think about things, that's all. Zoe. Alex. I called, but Sarah had already guided them around the corner. The second officer, a shorter woman with the nameplate Kim, stepped closer to me. Sir, I suggest you pack some essentials. You have 20 minutes. When Rodriguez stepped outside to speak with Sarah, Officer Kim leaned in slightly. I've seen a lot of these cases, she said quietly, handing me a business card. Contact a lawyer immediately. Don't talk to her directly, it could violate the order. Her eyes conveyed what her words couldn't, that she suspected something wasn't right about this situation. I have one, I said, pocketing the card. Jessica Levitt. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Good. Pack your things now. I moved mechanically around the bedroom, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag. My mind raced with implications. Sarah had escalated faster than I'd expected. This wasn't just about divorcing me, this was about destroying me, erasing me from our children's lives. As I gathered toiletries from the bathroom, I heard Zoe's voice in the hallway again, more insistent this time. I want to see Dad. I stepped out just as she broke free from Sarah's grasp and ran toward me. At 11, she was already showing the determination that would define her adult years. What's happening? She demanded, her eyes filled with confusion. I knelt to her level, aware of the officers watching. I need to go away for a little while, Zoe Bear. What? Did you do something bad? The simplicity of her question nearly broke me. No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups need space to figure things out. When will you come back? Her bottom lip trembled. Sooner than you think, I promised, pulling her into a hug. Over her shoulder, I saw Sarah watching us, her expression unreadable. Time's up, sir, Rodriguez said from behind me. I reluctantly released Zoe, who was now crying silently. Sarah immediately pulled her back, whispering something in her ear. As I carried my bags toward the front door, I noticed our neighbors watching from their windows and porches. Sarah had timed this perfectly, a public humiliation, a show for anyone who might later be called to testify about my character. On the porch, Sarah followed me out, raising her voice just enough to ensure the neighbors would hear. Please just leave us alone. The performance was flawless. I said nothing as I loaded my bags into my car. As I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed a folded piece of paper on the passenger seat that hadn't been there before. I opened it once I was down the street. My brother went through something similar. Call him. Below was a name, David Chan, and a phone number. At the end of our street stood the neighborhood sign, "Welcome to Cherry Hills, where dreams come true." The irony wasn't lost on me as I drove past it, leaving behind the life I had built so carefully. In my rearview mirror, Cherry Hills grew smaller. Ahead lay uncertainty but also possibility. Sarah had fired the first major salvo in our war, but she'd made a critical mistake. She'd underestimated how hard I would fight for my children. I picked up my phone and dialed Jessica Levitt's emergency number. This battle had just begun. The flickering neon sign of Stuck in Time Motel cast an eerie blue glow across my temporary accommodation. The name seemed cruelly appropriate. I felt suspended between my past life and an uncertain future. The room smelled of old cigarettes and cheaper cleaning products, a far cry from the home I'd designed with my own hands. I'd spent the morning on the phone with Jessica, who was already preparing an emergency motion to contest the restraining order. "This is a classic tactic," she'd explained. "She's establishing a narrative of you as unstable and dangerous. We need to counter it immediately." Around noon, I called the number Officer Kim had given me. David Chan answered on the third ring. "Mr. Kowalski? I've been expecting your call." His voice was calm, measured, professional. "You have. My sister mentioned she'd given you my number. I'm a psychiatrist specializing in anxiety disorders and personality evaluations." Within the hour, I was sitting across from him in his office. Dr. Chan was a thoughtful man in his 50s who listened more than he spoke. After I explained my situation, he leaned back in his chair, considering. "What you're describing sounds consistent with narcissistic personality traits, possibly disorder," he said. "Your wife is constructing a narrative where she's the victim and you're the aggressor, regardless of facts." He picked up a notepad. "Start documenting everything. Every interaction, every message. People with these patterns feed on emotional reactions. They provoke, then use your response as evidence against you." "How do I fight someone who rewrites reality?" I asked. "With consistent truth," he replied. "And by understanding that this isn't about logic or fairness for her. It's about control and winning at all costs." Back at the motel, I created a makeshift office, pinning evidence to the wall like a detective in a crime drama, a connection board showing the timeline of Sarah's deception. Marcus Finn arrived that evening with equipment to set up secure communications. "Your wife likely has access to your email, phone records, perhaps even banking notifications," he explained while installing encryption software on my laptop. "We need to establish channels she can't monitor." "Is that even possible?" I asked. "No system is perfect," he admitted. "But we can make it significantly harder for her." Together we created a secure method for communicating with the children. A digital deadrop that wouldn't trigger notifications on home devices Sarah might control. That night, Jessica called with troubling news. "Sarah's been busy," she said grimly. "She's already contacted your friends, colleagues, even the children's teachers, sharing her version of events." Jessica forwarded screenshots from the school parents chat group where Sarah had written about years of hiding her fear, and how she was finally finding the courage to protect her children. I scrolled through the messages with growing horror. People I'd known for years were offering her support, condemning me without hearing my side. Sarah had effectively weaponized our social circle. "This is character assassination," I said. "It's also predictable," Jessica replied. "She's establishing her narrative early. Remember what I said about the court of public opinion." Just as I was sinking into despair, there was a knock at my motel room door. I opened it to find Thomas, my friend of 20 years, standing there with a six-pack of beer. "I don't believe a word of it," he said without preamble. "I've known you and Sarah for 15 years. This doesn't sound like you." For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not everyone was accepting Sarah's version uncritically. Over beers, Thomas shared observations about Sarah's behavior over recent years. Mood shifts, inconsistencies, moments when she seemed to become a different person entirely. "Remember last Christmas party?" he asked. She was laughing, enjoying herself, then got a phone call. When she came back, it was like someone had flipped a switch. Cold, distant, making cutting remarks about everyone. "I attributed it to stress," I admitted. Thomas shook his head. "I've seen stress. That was something else." Before leaving, Thomas offered to be my eyes and ears. The kids miss you, he said. Alex keeps asking when you're coming home. Later that night, I received an email through our secure system from Zoe. My heart raced as I opened it. Dad, Mom says you did something bad but won't say what. Did you? I miss you. The house feels weird without you. I spent an hour crafting my response, careful to say nothing that could violate the restraining order or be used against me later. I simply reassured her of my love and promised we would see each other soon. The next day, I created a special journal for the children, a book with invisible ink writing that could only be revealed with a special light. I filled it with messages of love and reassurance, then arranged for Thomas to deliver it when he dropped off some items I'd forgotten. That evening, Marcus called with disturbing news. Sarah has removed all family photos featuring you from the house, he said. She's literally erasing your presence from the children's visual environment. The psychological warfare was escalating. Sarah wasn't just trying to remove me physically, she was attempting to erase me from our family narrative entirely. As I stared at the connection board on my motel wall, I realized this wasn't just about surviving divorce. It was about preserving my relationship with my children against someone willing to rewrite history to serve her purposes. Tomorrow would bring my first court appearance to contest the restraining order. It would be the first public battle in what was becoming a war for truth itself. 2 weeks of exile had changed me. The face staring back from the motel bathroom mirror belonged to a stranger, hollow-cheeked, with dark circles under eyes that had seen too little sleep and too much worry. I straightened my tie, a gesture from a normal life that now felt like play acting. Jessica had coached me extensively for today's preliminary hearing. First impressions matter, she'd said. Calm, collected, reasonable. No matter what she says or does. Outside the courthouse, an unexpected figure approached. Alice, our next-door neighbor for the past decade. Nick, she said quietly, pressing something into my hand, a small stone angel. Not everyone believes her stories. Before I could respond, she was gone, melting into the crowd of morning commuters. The small gesture of support steadied me as I climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations. Jessica waited by the courtroom doors, immaculate in a navy suit, her expression confident. Ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. We entered courtroom 3 just as Sarah arrived with her attorney, Richard Terrell. She was dressed in a cream-colored suit that radiated maternal wholesomeness, her makeup minimal, her demeanor subdued. The performance was calculated for maximum sympathy. Terrell was known for his emotional manipulation of juries, a theatrical lawyer who painted in broad strokes of sentiment rather than fine lines of fact. Jessica had warned me about him. When Sarah's eyes met mine across the courtroom, she looked down quickly, dabbing at non-existent tears with a tissue. The woman who had coldly threatened to destroy me was nowhere to be seen. In her place sat a fragile victim seeking protection. All rise, the bailiff called as Judge Elena Ramirez entered. Her reputation for thoroughness and impartiality had given me the first real hope since this nightmare began. Terrell opened with dramatic flair, presenting Sarah as a mother who endured years of emotional abuse, before finding the courage to protect herself and her children. He displayed the evidence Sarah had collected, our arguments taken out of context, moments of frustration presented as patterns of abuse, the broken wine glass from our confrontation described as a violent outburst. Ms. Kowalski lived in fear, Terrell concluded, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Fear that one day the emotional violence would become physical. Judge Ramirez listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Jessica rose, her approach couldn't have been more different. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes," she began, her voice measured. Today, Your Honor, truth has its shoes on and is ready to run. With methodical precision, she laid out the chronology of Sarah's deceptions, the years-long affair with Michael, the financial accounts Sarah had hidden, and most damning, the DNA test proving Alex wasn't my biological son. This isn't about protection, Jessica said. This is about preemptive strike. Miss Kowalski knew her deceptions were about to be exposed, so she struck first with this restraining order. Jessica revealed that Sarah had applied for the apartment rental 3 days before filing the restraining order. Evidence of premeditation, not fear. Marcus then presented his analysis of Sarah's recordings, highlighting the obvious signs of editing and manipulation. Throughout Jessica's presentation, I watched Judge Ramirez. Her interest visibly sharpened during the DNA test evidence, her eyes narrowing as she studied the documents. When my turn came to speak, I stood slowly, conscious of every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, I began, I'm an architect. My professional life is dedicated to building strong foundations. I believed my family stood on such a foundation of trust. I described my relationship with my children, our Saturday morning pancake rituals, the bedtime stories, the science projects with Zoe, the model planes with Alex. These aren't the actions of a father who... He's lying. Sarah's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. He's been manipulating the children for years. This is all part of his. Miss Kowalski. Judge Ramirez's sharp reprimand silenced Sarah instantly. Control yourself or you'll be removed. I noticed the judge's expression as she observed Sarah's outburst, the inconsistency between the frightened victim she'd presented herself as and this angry interruption hadn't gone unnoticed. After final arguments, Judge Ramirez announced she would reserve her decision. I need to carefully review all materials presented. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. As we filed out of the courtroom, I caught Sarah whispering urgently into her phone, Plan B. No. He knows too much. Jessica steered me toward the exit. That went as well as could be expected. The judge clearly has questions about Sarah's version of events. What's Plan B? I asked, the overheard whisper troubling me. Could be anything, Jessica replied. But Sarah seems like someone who always has a contingency plan. We need to be prepared. Outside the courthouse, reporters hovered at the perimeter. Sarah had apparently alerted the local press, adding another dimension to her public narrative construction. I drove back to the motel, the day's testimony replaying in my mind. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Judge Ramirez had seen through at least some of Sarah's performance. As I parked at the motel, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Worth checking your children's passports. Now. The message vanished seconds after I read it, a disappearing text. My blood ran cold as I realized what Sarah's Plan B might entail. I immediately called Jessica. Sarah might be planning to leave the country with the children, I said without preamble. I'll file an emergency motion to surrender passports right now, Jessica replied, her tone urgent. And I'll contact the court to expedite tomorrow's ruling. As night fell, I stood at the motel window, staring at the distant lights of Cherry Hills where my children slept, unaware of the battle being waged over their futures. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of vindication or a deeper descent into this nightmare. Either way, I would be ready. The anonymous text about the passports haunted me through a sleepless night. By dawn, I'd abandoned any attempt at rest and sat watching the sunrise from my motel window, a cup of bitter coffee cooling between my hands. My phone rang, an unknown number. I answered cautiously. Nicholas? This is Veronica. Sarah's mother's voice was thin with anxiety. We need to talk. I'm not sure that's a good idea, I replied, thinking of the restraining order. Please. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago. We arranged to meet at an all-night diner on the edge of town, far from Cherry Hills and prying eyes. I arrived first, claiming a booth in the back corner where we could speak privately. Veronica arrived 20 minutes later, clutching a large cardboard box. She'd aged since I'd last seen her at Christmas, new lines etched around her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she set the box on the table. I've stayed silent too long, she said without preamble. I was afraid she'd find out I told you, that she'd keep the children from me. She pushed the box toward me. Sarah's medical records. From when she was a teenager. My heart quickened as I opened the box. Inside were folders from 5 different psychiatric practices, spanning Sarah's adolescence. She was diagnosed with a combination of personality disorders at 16, Veronica explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah doesn't just deceive others, she believes her alternative versions of reality. I leafed through the records, my architect's mind trying to construct a coherent picture from these fragments of Sarah's hidden past. Different psychiatrists had arrived at similar conclusions. Narcissistic personality disorder, borderline tendencies, patterns consistent with psychopathic traits. Why didn't you tell me before we married? I asked, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. Veronica's eyes filled with tears. She was doing so well with you. I hoped, she had outgrown it. And then when I realized she hadn't, she threatened to cut me off from the grandchildren if I ever revealed her past. She described Sarah's childhood, her extraordinary ability to manipulate adults, even as a young girl. How she'd once accused a teacher of non-existent abuse, maintaining her story so convincingly that the man nearly lost his career before another student came forward with the truth. She can believe her own lies so deeply that she'd pass a lie detector test, Veronica said. In her mind, the story she creates becomes the truth. And now she's creating a story where I'm the villain, I said quietly. Veronica nodded. I recognized the pattern when I saw what she's doing to you. It's what she did to her father before he. She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the stale diner air. I thought of Alex and Zoe, growing up under Sarah's influence, learning to distort reality to suit their needs. A chill ran through me. This isn't just about divorce anymore, I said, realization dawning. It's about saving my children from psychological damage. Be careful, Veronica warned. When Sarah feels cornered, she becomes dangerous. Not physically, but she'll destroy anything to protect her version of reality. I thanked her for taking the risk to meet me, understanding what it had cost her. As she left, she turned back briefly. I should have done this years ago. I'm sorry. I immediately called Jessica, who arranged to meet me at her office despite the early hour. Dr. Levinson, a forensic psychiatrist who worked with her firm, joined us to review the records. This is textbook, he said after examining the files. Classic presentation of a cluster B personality disorder with particularly concerning narcissistic and antisocial features. How does this help us? I asked Jessica. Fundamentally, she replied. We'll file for an emergency psychiatric evaluation and temporary custody transfer pending the results. These records provide the historical basis for our concern. While they prepared the necessary legal documents, I stepped out onto the office balcony, needing air. Cherry Hills spread before me in the distance, morning sunlight gleaming off windows like so many mirrors, reflecting only what was in front of them, hiding what lay behind. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, urgent. Sarah packing kids' bags. Saying something about a surprise trip. Panic surged through me. I rushed back inside, showing Jessica the message. She's running, Jessica said, immediately dialing Judge Ramirez's clerk. We need that emergency order now. Within an hour, we had a signed emergency order requiring Sarah to surrender the children's passports and prohibiting her from taking them outside the county. Jessica dispatched a courier to deliver it to our house with a police escort to ensure compliance. I paced Jessica's office, waiting for confirmation that the order had been served. When my phone finally rang, it was Officer Rodriguez. Mr. Kowalski, you need to get here now. His voice was tense. Your wife is refusing to comply with the order, and the situation is escalating. Are my children safe? I asked, already heading for the elevator. They're upset but physically fine. Your friend Thomas is here too. It seems he came to check on something and found Miss Kowalski packing suitcases at midnight. As Jessica and I raced toward Cherry Hills, I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. After nearly 15 years of marriage, I was about to see Sarah's carefully constructed persona completely unravel. What I couldn't prepare for was how that unraveling would affect our children, or how far Sarah would go to maintain her version of reality when all her deceptions were finally exposed to the light. I drove toward Cherry Hills with reckless speed, Jessica calling ahead to ensure we wouldn't be stopped. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel as I navigated the familiar streets that led home. From 2 blocks away, I could see the flashing lights of police cruisers in front of our house. My house, their red and blue pulses painting the night with urgency. Neighbors stood on porches and lawns in bathrobes and pajamas, watching the drama unfold like some late-night reality show. Officer Rodriguez met me at the curb. She's refusing to let anyone inside, he explained as I approached. Says she's just planning a vacation and everyone is overreacting. Where are my children? I demanded. Inside. We've heard their voices. They sound upset but not in danger. Jessica caught up with me, legal documents in hand. We have the emergency custody order signed by Judge Ramirez. She's in direct violation if she doesn't comply immediately. I approached the front door, which opened before I could knock. Thomas stood there, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. Thank God you're here, he said. I came over when I saw her packing suitcases at midnight. Something seemed off. Behind him, Sarah's voice rose in a hysterical pitch. He's trespassing. Arrest him. He broke into my house. I pushed past Thomas into the living room where Sarah stood, wild-eyed and gesturing at the officers. She'd abandoned any pretense of the calm, frightened victim she'd portrayed in court. This Sarah was frantic, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. You're all part of his conspiracy, she shouted, pointing at everyone in turn. He's poisoned all of you against me. Mom? Zoe's voice cut through the chaos. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, Alex half hidden behind her. What's happening? Daddy? Alex bolted from behind his sister and ran to me. I knelt to catch him in my arms, the familiar weight of my son, regardless of biology, anchoring me in the storm of Sarah's making. Zoe approached more cautiously, her 11-year-old face too serious, too understanding for her age. Mom said we were going on a long trip where you couldn't find us. Sarah lunged forward. They're my children. You can't take them. Officer Kim stepped between us. Ma'am, we have a court order. You need to comply. I showed the officers the emergency custody transfer and psychiatric evaluation order that Jessica had obtained based on Veronica's evidence. This is temporary until Ms. Kowalski undergoes evaluation, Jessica explained to the officers. The children will remain with their father pending that assessment. This is all lies. Sarah's voice shifted abruptly, becoming eerily calm. There's been a misunderstanding. I was just planning a surprise vacation for the children. Spring break is coming up. The sudden change in her demeanor was jarring. A complete personality shift that confirmed everything in the psychiatric records. Officer Kim noticed the travel bag on the entry table. May I? She asked, gesturing toward it. Before Sarah could object, Kim opened the bag and removed 3 plane tickets. Mexico City, she said, examining them. One way. Departing tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Mexico. No extradition treaty for family court matters. Sarah had been planning to disappear with our children beyond the reach of U.S. courts. Sarah's face contorted with rage again. Those are private. You have no right. The front door opened and Judge Ramirez herself entered, having responded to Jessica's emergency call. The judge took in the scene, the plane tickets, Sarah's erratic behavior, the frightened children. Ms. Kowalski, she said with authority that instantly quieted the room. Your behavior tonight leaves me no choice but to order a temporary psychiatric hold for evaluation. Officers, please ensure Ms. Kowalski is transported safely to Central Memorial for assessment. You can't do this. Sarah shrieked as Officers Rodriguez and Kim approached her. This is kidnapping. This is. Mom, stop, Zoe pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Please just stop. Something in Zoe's voice seemed to reach Sarah. She stilled, then leaned close to me as the officers led her past. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice suddenly cold and controlled again. Stories always have multiple versions. I watched as they escorted her to the waiting police car, this stranger who had shared my bed, my name, my life for 14 years. Judge Ramirez approached where I stood with the children. I've reviewed all the evidence, including the medical records provided today. The full hearing will proceed as scheduled, but given tonight's events and Ms. Kowalski's apparent flight risk, I'm granting you temporary full custody pending her psychological evaluation. A week later, we sat in the same courtroom where our battle had begun. Sarah, now medicated and under psychiatric care, sat subdued beside Richard Terrell, who had dramatically scaled back his theatrical approach in light of the medical evidence. Judge Ramirez's ruling was unequivocal. Full custody to me, with Sarah granted supervised visitation only after completing a court-approved treatment program for her disorders. The court finds that Ms. Kowalski's untreated conditions pose a significant risk to the children's psychological development, Judge Ramirez concluded. This arrangement will be reassessed in 6 months, contingent upon Ms. Kowalski's progress in treatment. 1 year later, I stood in our new home, smaller than the Cherry Hills house but filled with more honesty, watching Zoe and Alex arrange their rooms. Zoe found an old family photograph in a box she was unpacking. Sometimes it's hard to know what was real, she said, studying the smiling faces of our former family unit. What's real is what we're building now, I told her, together day by day. Alex looked up from his model airplane. Will we ever see Mom again? Yes, I answered honestly. When she's ready. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, I sat at my desk working on a special project, restoring Zoe's broken childhood clock. I'd finally found all the missing pieces and carefully reassembled the mechanism. As I set it ticking again, I thought about time, how it reveals truth eventually, how it heals even the deepest wounds if we allow it to. The clock's steady rhythm was a reminder that forward was the only direction worth moving. Tomorrow Sarah would have her first supervised visit since beginning serious treatment. The children were nervous but hopeful. So was I, cautiously. The clock ticked on my desk, whole again despite having been broken. Some things with enough care and patience could be repaired. Other things, like trust once shattered, could only be rebuilt into something entirely new. Either way we would move forward. One honest moment at a time.